Okay, got it. I don't have to like complete this presentation. It's just all of this is just to offer departure points. So feel free to interrupt anytime. But I wanted to start with like discussing open source and what we normally associate with it. When you like Google what open science means, Google image, you get like for some reason a lot of them are these like really funny circular infographics that have this, like all of these like bubbles coming out of it. So we associate like open hardware, like open evaluative processes, citizen science, where science is like kind of like crowdsourced, or like there's community engagement. You see that here too, with marginalized scholars, local communities. There's open notebook and open data, which means that, information is constantly shared. And you have like open infrastructures that allow for participation through multiple nodes. And so all of this like theoretically makes a lot of sense. But then this is also what you find when you look at like the open source bad graphic design like infographics, which is, kind of like this, sorry, what's happening? Do you hear my computer doing that or no? Okay, never mind. And so basically you see that you have like, researchers in developing countries can see your work, taxpayers get value for money, compliant with grand rules, public can access your findings, your research can influence policy, etc. And so you start to see how like open access is very valuable for institutions and like what rubrics they use to measure that value. That makes like, specifically I'm interested in like open source applications of biotech, and there are these like 6 laws of drug discovery recently published. And so that puts all of these like principles, which are also like, we might say good principles like in theory, but when they apply to specifically generating a particular type of value form, and like consolidating influence, whether that's through citations or whether that's through like, kind of institutional sanctioning, then you start to see how open source, like the definitions start shifting, and like its advantages become simultaneously advantages to bigger institutions. And so I think that that's kind of like the basis of where I would start with a critique of like, is open source radical or not? And yeah, and if anybody wants to like interrupt me at this point and like add like anything to the critique, please feel free to do so, because I also now have like very specific examples, especially in biotech today, where there are certain like limitations and problems, and like the points of co-optation begin to expose themselves. So I'll just take like a little beat here and then go into examples if people want me to.
I'm curious if Sonali's like interruption about like sort of like the breaking of open source inherent from like this inherent idea of radicality and like potency for disruption like resonates with anyone, or if it was like, oh wow, I actually never thought about that, or actually never conceived that these two things are separate, or if it like moved anyone's thinking or expanded anyone's thinking in any way. Okay, I see it. I come off mute, bless us.
Not so much that I have an answer, but more so that I really appreciate this like kind of like an interruption into this idea that just because of the way open source organizes people and like cultivates a certain type of relationshiping doesn't necessarily mean it gets us any closer to liberation. So having to force ourselves to deeper interrogate like, what can we do to keep these relationship technologies that develop out of open source from falling into, the hands of the other side? That's something that's going to require some deep reflection and imagination and experimenting. So it's a great interruption. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I wonder, this is a really complicated field, and its relationship to the market is really complicated, and I'm sure you're going to get into that more, but I think there is this inherent radicality of things being open. Things not having market logic applied to them is just inherently radical in the context that we live in. But the market logic kind of seeps in through the cracks at the same time. And we start to see open source as an extended recruiting tool for tech monoliths. We start to see it as a way of sealing people into ecosystems so that a worker's skill is directly tracked to an open source software by a large tech company with interest in keeping a consolidated tech skill tree. So there are all these ways that they're insidious, and we've seen maybe it's like over the 40, 50 or plus years of open source software, it starts to seep in and affect it, but there remains that radical impulse. And so I hope we have a conversation about that tension. And I think it was brought up that tension also exists in movements, with how the nonprofit industrial complex also has market logics kind of like pushing and exerting forces on movements. And I think the thing that's interesting for me is this is always going to be inevitable when we have like limited energy resources as human beings. You know, like we have to make money to survive. Anytime we're using our energy resources for something other than survival, it's susceptible to influence by the market. We're not impervious. And so, yeah, I'm just curious to see how we can like share the lessons about like safeguarding our energy resources and safeguarding the intent of them across those different domains.
Yeah, I feel like I don't have much to add because everything that everyone said has been so brilliant. But the one thing that I am really thinking about is the ways in which open source is just a tool, similar to political frameworks, similar to relational frameworks, that it is a tool. And despite the fact that there is inherent radicality to anything pushing back against proprietary and privatized ownership and under like a capitalist landscape, it's the same way that in movements that using a shorthand like anarchism, and I'm seeing people talk about abolition when they're thinking about their words, right? That things that become a shorthand for a framework are more highly susceptible to be co-opted or easy to kind of warp into a perspective that does not necessarily benefit radicalism in the long run. And also, like, what do we even mean by radicalism, right? What future are we working towards? What collectivized resources are we working towards? What are we actually thinking about? And so I'm excited to hear more about the way that that open source is kind of like working, as you said, in tension with this, and as both as a technology and as a kind of like system of relation.
Yeah, I think this tension is exactly what I want to like kind of demonstrate through examples. But I also think that like in the biotech space, that tension is really evident right now because like life is open source, you know, like DNA is, and like the information that's contained in our genomes is like spreads through horizontal gene transfer through viruses. Like we propagate ourselves, you know, like basically there is a code to life, and that code remains open fundamentally, but there is like this kind of enclosure coming in where now you have like particular life processes that are starting to be patented, and so you kind of have this kind of like weird tension between like information sharing and like how that facilitates like the capacity of people to build bigger and wider and like profit more. Like open source is actually quite profitable. Like it allows things to scale to like an extent that, you know, starting with like just like private resources can't. It allows for like rapid iteration through like distributed infrastructure, where somebody who's working on a particular like mode of generating, synthesizing, whatever, say a molecule, like I'll just go kind of into the open insulin project. Basically, this was an effort. So you know that insulin costs a lot. It's one of the like key molecules that make like explode healthcare costs for diabetics. It's one of the key molecules that if we can distribute the infrastructure for making it, it's the gene itself. Human insulin is not patentable, but analogs of insulin have been patented and have been basically a site of consolidation by pharma companies. like, and this continues to be. And so basically there's like this kind of ecology between counterculture labs, biocurious, all like community labs, citizen science labs that came out of the Bay Area. So like people who are building these are like, Gen and Tech employees, like kind of like white collar biotech workers, or like, who in their spare time or just as like a hobby have put enormous amounts of resources to like kind of build these kind of community labs that actually have a lot of infrastructure, and then start projects like Open Insulin. And you can see it, they say it's affordable, it's transparent pricing, it's community owned, and the idea is that it distributes knowledge for how to make infrastructure. It is able to make different analogs because people are exploring these in like different labs all over. It reduces supply chain costs because now insulin doesn't have to be shipped and travel over long distances on like in frozen vials, and so all of these like market rationales actually are now used to justify like why a citizen science initiative is worth exploring, and so you start to see the like how like market rationales become then why like Cell Journal and like academics and institutions are like, we should do like Open Insulin is great, we should pursue this, we should pursue models like this, and we should fund models like this through like grants, etc. And then you start to get like these kinds of like cost benefit analyses where open source is actually now just a model for doing business, not a particular like ethos necessarily of its own. It's a model that optimizes supply chain distribution, it optimizes innovation, it optimizes iteration, et cetera, et cetera. And so we kind of see this like easy slide, and I think that like one of the only reasons I talked to the guy who like primarily worked on Open Insulin for a few years, and he said like the main issue they're facing is actually just scale, and the scale comes into, you have to purify insulin so you can like take any bacteria, introduce the gene for insulin, produce it in large quantities, but then you have to purify it for human use. And that purification process is something that is really dependent on industrial processes, actually. And so you can't scale it. And I think that this is a really interesting thing because it exposes maybe how the methodology of technology is actually like premised on a particular type of market calculation, which is that like purification is very costly, and these resins that you need to like separate insulin from all the other proteins, these are too costly to scale. And then basically this like kind of problem faced by like a citizen science grassroots initiative is then most easily solvable by large academic institutions and governments. And this is kind of what leads to like there's other initiatives like the Open Malaria Project, Open Pharma Science Foundation, and these are actually like large scale initiatives being taken up by like India. Texas has like a large vaccine development that interfaces with these initiatives, and so they start to become institutionalized, and it's because they can, according to them, solve the problem of scale in a way that grassroots efforts that birthed these technologies can't. So I just want to like kind of show that transition through like the view of this one example. Elaborate on like another example if it's like helpful. Yeah.
I know personally that the 4 Thieves example that you gave when we were having this conversation will probably also be helpful and like come up later. I think now would be interesting to transition to like this conversation, like pulling out what you said about how the problems become most solvable by these like institutions, even if they're not inherently here. How do we change the view back to what it was? Do you mind stop sharing? Okay, cool. Oh, and it went back to the spotlight, period. Okay. How they become problems, like to begin with, like the framework of a problem in which like the neoliberal like thrives of like, oh, we're going to come up with the step 1, step 2, step 3 to like solve the problems, and rather than like processes to disrupt, or processes of co-optation, or processes of anti-life to sort of open source's life, to disrupt or to destroy, or systems to destroy or to bring to its knees, so that the inherent value or necessity of money is not there to begin with. Back to that word radical. right? And so the academics and the markets and so on and so forth sort of co-opt these things in these projects and become these massive projects, and these become the only way. And I think Eva and Parisa, I just from what I know about you, I think this is exactly what we're seeing happen in movement. And I saw some of your notes, Eva, like even bringing in the nonprofit industrial complex into how it also co-ops open source technology. And so I'm interested in like moving into the conversation into how to disrupt this institutionalization. What have you learned on the front lines of your work or within your work within open source or in the streets to sort of disrupt that process? Let's start with whoever wants to start. I don't feel like calling names right now. Whoever wants to start, whoever feels so called.
I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking about as a deep parallel here is the way in which movements are asked to be scaled. That every time there is a quote unquote successful movement or something that works, there is the urgency from nonprofit actors, from governments, from whoever the fuck wants to be in power, from even corporations who are thinking about how they can monetize and kind of profit off of the ethos, as you say, of resistance. And how do you scale it up as much as possible? I'm thinking about all the people that I know that kind of used to be involved in like housing movements or grassroots kind of climate movements in New York, and especially New York, thinking about survival and thinking about the ways in which people have to monetize their skills in order to, you know, be in the world. Just, you know, like we're here talking about this right now. The question of scale to me is a lot of the ways in which movements are cut off at the knees. Grassroots radicalism necessitates hyperlocality, necessitates a version of specific care that is attuned to the conditions that you're living in and your community is living in. The word community is like very broad and definable, but I'm going to use it loosely here. But then the question of how do we, if we figure out a way of creating sustainable agriculture or creating a sustainable governance model or one of these things, there's the urgency to also to share it with as many folks as possible, but to think about, does that model actually work in the space and the landscape that it's in? And I'm thinking about what does that mean in the context of things like medical sciences, that all bodies are different and specific and everybody needs specific forms of care. However, there are basic things that can be scaled in order to ensure survival or to make survival a little bit more possible. And so how do you kind of combat this? How do you think about hyperspecificity and locality in a technology as well as in a relation? And that's not really an answer to a question. That's just like another question to pose, maybe to see if Eva has any thoughts.
I think this conversation will be a lot of questions to pose. And I think that's what makes it juicy. Like, I don't think we're going to land on anything, but hopefully like pull more people in to keep asking questions that get us closer to specificity. But yeah, I think Parisa is right. The way that I understand all of this, these technologies we're making, whether they be digital open source technologies or technologies for things like jail support, food systems, interpersonal relating, all of those are technologies, but the container, the literal soil that we're growing them in is late stage capitalism. And I think in our enthusiasm, in our excitement, we jump into this work, we jump into these new formations, we jump into these new possibilities without first underscoring that one of the mechanisms of whatever we're building will have to be resisting the co-optation. So if you come back later and you're like, oh no, we're in the process of possibly getting co-opted, or to Parisa's point, we're in the process of like nonprofits telling us we need to scale up larger than the capacity that our community has, or the large beyond the scope that our team said that we can access, it's already too late. I think a foundational mechanism of every technology that we are making has to be, how will we resist the coming co-optation? Because in the stage of capitalism that we're in, anything and everything can and will be cannibalized towards the goals of capitalism's longevity. And I think this is something I've learned not from theory, but like from moving from a young organizer to, I hope, towards a more experienced organizer. That like in the beginning, I would hop into projects and to really cool ideas and have no grounding or foundational awareness of the ways that once this starts working and becomes impactful, capitalism will make a attempt at stealing it and co-opting it from us. To now, like one of the first things that we get into when we're building new things, when we're growing new things, is like, what will be our offensive strategy when the co-optation process starts? And I know that's not necessarily like it's not like a concrete, how do we resist this? But I think it is a process offering for folks who are looking towards how they can use open source to better support on the ground movements, frontline movements. I think that should be a part of your process, is to anticipate co-optation and to build strategies to resist and antagonize against it.
As someone who has a lot of experience in these massive open source, massively successful in the capitalist sense, open source projects, like I'm curious about your thoughts on this question, but also some of your reactions to what folks are saying, like, and especially given your, let's say, like political orientation.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to latch onto here. Everyone's making really good points. I think viewing open source as a style of production is pretty accurate at this point, as Sonali points out, but I think it discounts maybe the like kind of emotional cultural attachment to the meaning of what it is to do open source software. And I think that still has power. I think the like original impulse of like building a tool, making it free, and sharing and iterating the process of building that tool with one another remains kind of the guiding principle that most open source software is built on. So a lot of open source software, I'm not as familiar with the biotech space, but a lot of open source software is about building the kind of base materials and tools that allow other people to make things. I think the issue with this is that they're like oriented towards an idea of the neutral. And so they're just perfect for co-optation. Doesn't even require a reframing of their purpose to co-opt them, right? Whereas if you build a set of tools for making decisions among a non-hierarchical organization that has like an embedded ethos in the project, if you build a tool that like defeats surveillance in some meaningful way that has like an embedded worldview inside of it. And I think something because I think the idea of scale is really important here. And I do think that the thing that both movements and open source software hold at their core is this kind of romanticization of like autopoiesis, or like this machine that generates itself. Like we'll all become part of this like swarm intelligence, and will effortlessly create this thing that's much bigger than us and runs on its own. And we see that failing primarily because once something gains that momentum, the forces of co-optation are that much more urgent, right? And so I think that like thinking about why they share this kind of orientation towards scaling as like a feedback loop mechanism is really useful in understanding how they can speak to one another.
I would almost wonder if, kind of in that sense, like if scale can be a strategy to adaptation, like in and of itself, because actually like scale is important to me. We can have a lot of like open access journals and open like citizen labs and open source software, but it doesn't matter if people don't use them at scale and like deploy them meaningfully in their own lives in imaginative ways. And I think that like for me, that's where the issue of scale comes in. Like I do want insulin to be accessible by everyone, not just people who can afford it, but also not just people who have time to like go and attend meetings at a community lab, you know. And I want us to kind of aspire to scale in this like meaningful way. And I think that like one of the very interesting things, and I'm sorry to keep talking about biotech, but like I almost feel like the space of biotech, like industrial biotech, is actually very fragmented, and it's all of these like small startups that are doing very individual things, and there's not this like industrial cohesive infrastructure. But you know, the Biden administration is trying to build that, and they call that the bioeconomy, and this is like kind of the coming like revolution or like restructuring of the economy that we can expect. And I'm just wondering, like, can scale prevent co-optation? Can we distribute technologies before they can be regulated out of existence or access? Can we, like, create infrastructures that allow for the free flow of like little bits of DNA or like little pieces of information, little bits of code before those become like patented and regulated by like FDA to protect corporate interests of things that are just now hitting the market. And like the mycologists have made, like they're like the freaks who make like a lot of innovations in these spheres. Like you go to mycology conferences and you get handed some fungi that can break down plastic that's like developed at Yale, that's patent pending or something, and like I guess this is, to me, like goes back to the sort of like cultural, like hacky kind of like impulse to share and to distribute before things can get co-opted that Stella just talking about. But yeah, I do wonder about what that looks like when you do it at scale.
The question of scale also brings up to me the constant tension between, and this is like coming from like an abolitionist community perspective of accessibility versus security and those kinds of questions. And like, what do we mean also by security? Do we mean a security of access, or do we mean a security of, is it refusing co-optation? Is it something that can be privatized? Is it something that can be stolen by the other side? Or is it something that makes people more vulnerable? And thinking about like open sourcing skill sets within the resistance movements, that's one of the things that comes up a lot in abolition, is like, how do we keep ourselves safe from surveillance and from police? And also, how do we think about how to create different forms of safety that are accessible to everyone else? And there is the impulse that I just said of the hive mind mindset, that if we skill up enough at one level, that it'll just proliferate and that we'll have safety, and that it's not something that needs to be practiced constantly, something that needs to be re-articulated constantly, and needs to be oriented towards the needs of the specific group of people that you're working with. And so one of the practices that we had was like, for a while, jail support was something that was held by a very specific group of people in New York, and was at the needs of the movement in that moment, or maybe we just thought it was the needs of the movement in that moment, that there were a specific group of people that were trained, that had a set of security protocols so that information was not flying around when people were vulnerable to arrest. That stopped serving us, and it was still open, anyone could join, but there was a kind of incredibly intensive vetting process for people to come in because of the fear of cop jacketing and all the other things. And what ended up being the most productive change was to open source jail support practices, to make the trainings accessible, to distribute a zine that was editable by anybody, and that to let go of that. That brings in a whole bunch of other things. Right now, jail support is a tactic that is completely legal and has been done for as long as prisons have existed. However, it's not always completely transparent to the powers that be that people are doing it. So what does it mean now that that the language of jail support becomes something that is accessible to police? What does it mean now that jail support is something that is accessible to nonprofits? Not that I think that nonprofits are particularly interested in it, but what does it mean now that we have released the knowledge and that the knowledge is being proliferated and that so many people are contributing to it? Who are we then protecting, and what is the way of resourcing that? And the kind of second question that I have around that is that it does enable scale, that if more people have the skill set, that if more people are able to do jail support on their own, it becomes a stronger ecosystem and infrastructure. But the kind of line of how do we resist co-optation only comes, as Sal just said, in the kind of trying to have an inherent resistance framework, which is we are against prisons and we are for the destruction of prisons in all of its forms. That's the only way that it refuses. And as soon as it steps away from that in any form, it's no longer jail support. It's no longer part of the same open source project. So that is my movement example.
One thing I quickly love to offer, and like Miliaku, Sonali, you all can probably speak to this as well. One of the key tools, and in my experience, I experience it in some ways as a hiccup, is this emphasis on decentralization. And it really came up when Parisa was discussing like how jail support adapted to the needs of the climate. The movement to stop Cop City is incredibly decentralized, and people consistently and constantly resist any consolidation of authority, even if it's happening on accident, just because you happen to be the loudest person in the room. And to me, like this like ecosystemic hive of people coming together to co-create and concurrently create this movement has been really beautiful to watch. But it really shows that this concept of decentralization needs more support in moving from the realm of theory into practice. Because when decentralization, so far on the ground, the way we've experienced it is like everyone's doing everything, but no one's responsible for anything. And no one's responsible for anything works great when we're coming up against the state, but no one's responsible for anything does not work great when we put our comrades in harm, when we're not accountable to the things we're saying we have to do. So as we're deepening this conversation between what does open source have to learn from movements, I'm really interested in what movements have to learn from open source, because Stalja, you really hit it the nail on the head when you talked about like this inherent neutrality that we have to combat as a part of our work to combat co-optation. Decentralization, I think we should have added it to the words that get overused in movement these days. Like, yeah, we're decentralized, but what does it mean about the rigor and the impact of our work? What decentralization is not inherently something that's super radical unless we're doing it and using it in a means that further liberate our people and further skill us up to be ready for the war with the state.
Yeah, thank you for that, Eva. I think that's a really vital point. I wonder what the relationship is between like this love for decentralization and this hope for something that just like generates itself, this like feedback loop. And because we see that happening, we see like mimetic culture like give energy to the Stop Cop City movement, and we see that and we're like, okay, well that's just gonna go and like run away on its own at some point, right? And we can like feel safe in that momentum itself generates, but it's not, it's happening, but it's not happening enough that it's won yet, right? And I wonder about Sonali's question of like, can scale resist co-optation? How does centralization versus decentralization fit into that? I think often about the CyberSyn program in Chile. That was like an attempt to do like pretty elaborate centralized planning under the Allende government. And like, what would the modern equivalent be? Because it can't be prescriptive from like a central point about what the decentralized bodies do, but it can like give them the resources for sharing and give them processes that are effective so that they're kind of like all nodes in this network that feed on the momentum and energy and learning and iteration of one another. One project that like I'm interested in, I'm not sure if I would say it's radical, but like an open source project that I'm interested in is the Foundation for Public Code, because what it does is it takes open source software as a model for building things like train timetables that keep like vital, like critical infrastructure for that people need running, and it builds them with the help of nation states, but like in a way that the nation states then become dependent on one another and kind of like incapable of like rendering that like without value. And I think that that's like an interesting model for how movements can start to like share resources, because we're all prone to like disagreeing and fighting and like defeating each other's momentum. But at a certain point, if we're sharing something critical to the way we develop our process or the tools or resources we're using, and it's centralized in that sense, then there's a limit to how much we can defeat each other with infighting. That's what comes up for me.
I really, I think that's a really, really critical point. And I think it like ties in very well to the questions that you raised, Carissa, about like security. And also like, you know, like what you said, Eva, about like no one's responsible for anything. So like, how does it all come together necessarily? And I guess like, okay, so I'm going to give this example, like, I think it just really fits here, which is like during the COVID pandemic, it was like April, like the pandemic, really everything shut down in March 2020. And in April, there was this like, it just started off as a Slack channel of like different scientists and academics. And it was called Just One Giant Lab. And I found it, you know, during lockdown when I was in Madison. And I went and took, I shouldn't probably admit this, a bunch of enzymes from the -20C refrigerator that could basically, like, it's RNA polymerase, so it like amplifies RNA in a test tube. And I took them to a community lab in Chicago because that was the closest community lab I could find through this like Slack channel of 400 scientists. And it was this lady, she like runs her like plant genome engineering company out of it, but she turns part of it into a community lab for high schoolers to like look at petri dishes. And she had an OpenTrons machine, which is a machine that can like, it's like a liquid handling robot that can like scale up the tests that you do to thousands per day. And just with like, the few tubes of enzymes I had, we could like run at least 6,000 to 10,000 tests and like do bottom ups COVID testing when none existed. Actually, like PCR tests weren't really a large scale thing at that point. And and people on this Slack channel were just like, all scientists just giving each other advice like, hey, have you heard about this system? You could like deploy it, and here's how you can make it cheaper, and here's how you can just use a colorimetric sensor to like test this thing. And within like 2 weeks, so she plugged in the -80 to store human samples when I went into the lab. And within 2 weeks, somebody from DARPA had joined the Slack channel, and the Seattle lab had got a door knock by the FBI, and they were why are you like, we think it's all kosher, but we just want to make sure that you're, doing this right. And then that person reports to the Slack channel. And then the DARPA person is like, oh, you don't want to get a door knock from the FBI? Well, here's a legit way to do it. The military is now like handing out these micro grants. And so if you want your community lab to just like, be totally legit, fill out these micro grants, and we can basically like, and so like, it just kind of became this thing. And synthetic biologists, like most of our research is funded by DARPA anyway. But it just kind of like the thing with security is that actually it was an impulse towards security by the researchers, an impulse towards security by like, we want to really validate COVID testing, making sure it's all done right. And it's an impulse. It's like, and then actually the person who was running that lab wrote and was funded by DARPA to write architectures of trust model for open source science, which is how like different labs can work together, like DIY biohackers can work with institutions in architectures of trust to validate safety, security, responsibility, and to basically, get like distribute resources correctly. And I just think that I just wonder, to contextualize like Stalder's questions, what if just one giant lab, that Slack channel, had just said, fuck the government, they're not going to take care of us, we take care of ourselves? Like, what if that was an ethos built in? Would it have been kind of like co-opted in this way? And what if, like, how could these like community labs manufacture the kind of dependencies between each other to like create the kind of central like cohesion, not like a top-down strategy, but the cohesion that would prevent, like the microgrants from having the kind of allure that they did, and like to also like guarantee safety for each other. And I think that, that's like a really interesting way to think for me. Next time the next pandemic comes, I'll consider these questions.
I really quickly want to say, I said this in the chat, but I want to offer it again. I love that in your work, there's 2 types of technologies that you're playing with, right? Like the work that you're doing in the lab around this very urgent global event happening, and then the work you're doing among the people you work with, which I think Miliaku and Persa will also speak to, like you thinking about how these labs can be like moved away from the dependency on these grants and these big institutions that obviously don't care about you as human beings. That is a whole nother type of development of technology. And it's so cool to hear that they're happening concurrently for you.
Yeah. So y'all are going off. We've pretty much gone through all the planned questions. So I was just gonna source questions from the audience. I see that Ria dropped one in. But before we maybe get into audience questions, I just wanted to like just picking up on where you left off, Sonali, and like kind of picking up from where you began, where this sort of like, I'm just reading my notes and not try to pretend like I'm not. When we are talking about open source as life, like you kind of just named an ethos that, that this lab could have deployed. What are the other principles, orientations, ethoses, and how could they be, for lack of a better word, implemented in people's work to resist this co-optation, even if that is using open source tech. I'm just curious about other thoughts that folks have on ethoses, that even if you feel like it's more of what open source can learn from the physical front lines and what the physical front lines can, however you want to situate that within the evolving discourse of today. I hope we're using it correctly, Eva. Okay.
One thing I'm thinking about is like going back to Stalji's original point of like, how do we refuse, or not original, one of your many points, but how do we refuse neutrality, is thinking about how our systems built in as resistant at every fundamental step of work. So thinking about things that at a base level are about prioritizing the preservation of human life, and not just human life, but human life that is working in refusal to the hierarchies of life that have been created for the last 500 years specifically, and thinking about vulnerability as a factor, thinking about how do we prioritize vulnerable life over productivity in a specific scale, and to think about that as always being at the center of work. That's one of the things that I think helps refuse co-optation really immensely. It's really easy to get lost in a bunch of language or tactics or a group of people, but when you're thinking about how do you center human life and the preservation of human life, it's really easy to actually get back to a non-co-optable practice, because that's inherently antithetical to capitalism. And so thinking about Sonali's example, that like, what would have happened if from the beginning there was a kind of like no military involved process? What would have happened if there were specific cultures set up so that people were thinking about sharing all this information, but so that it could never be co-opted by the military, so that it could never be privatized, and so that it could never be deployed by governments in this really specific way? That it built in this question of how are we holding life as precious, and how are we refusing death and proximity to death. As I'm always quoting Ruth Wilson Gilmore, which I did last time too, but refusing the proximity to death and people's group differentiated vulnerabilities to death, that holds us at a kind of moral and ethical line that brings us closer to the kind of ethos of liberation that I want to participate in.
Yeah, that was really, really well said. And I wonder, and this is me being maybe a little bit demented, but I wonder, is an open source process a good process to arrive at like those set of founding principles? Like, could you take like an iterable, decentralized process that evolves over time and allows it to be dynamic to like create this like way of thinking about like what is a moral, ethical, liberatory project?
To me, this also kind of gets back to the question around imaginative technology that you posed, Eva, like towards the beginning, or maybe it was in our pre-talk. I don't know. Sorry, blurs. But yeah, like if there's like if open is fundamentally enough, like open to what? I guess, or like where, like, you know, to me the enclosure sometimes is built into the methodology itself, where, for instance, if you see a living cell as something to extract a useful molecule from, like you can take that technology and you can make it open source, but is it like opening up like a new frontier, a new way of understanding synthetic biology, or a new way of understanding life itself? And like this is kind of like, to me, the non-neutrality of it is also to kind of like remain open to, yeah, like to open to different cosmologies, to different orderings of the world, different ways of understanding our methodologies, and to see that ethics are not just like, they're surely and definitely like embedded in our relations to each other and how we like collectivize our skills and produce something, or not produce something and remain inoperative, which is also like, you know, a cool ethos that fits into the open source umbrella. But I think that there's also like the ethics are also embedded in the technology itself. And I wonder if the neutrality can take a stand on certain technologies. Like go to these conferences and I see open plant, like, you know, this like open source plant genome engineering thing, collaborating with Monsanto, because Monsanto is like, oh, great, open source makes our work more palatable, you know? And like, I just miss, and like, you know, Ginkgo Bioworks, like their Grow magazine actually like does a lot to kind of proliferate a particular way of seeing the world, a particular epistemology through banners of like openness, and like you even see it with like synthetic hormones, and like, you know, that allowing for like transness and different ways of being to come into life. But like if those synthetic hormones are like old, like patented by Pfizer, you know, like to what extent is Pfizer then gatekeeping, like kind of, yeah. But anyway, now I'm rambling. I just want to like point out multiple different types of openness, like an openness of cosmology and also an openness in like the infrastructure and organization. Yeah.
This has been so great, y'all. I'm like, okay, yeah, this, I wish, I'm sorry, I kind of want to do the thing I did last time where we ran a little late. But just to close out, Eva, and if anyone has to respond to Eva, you know, what you gonna do? Do you want to take a stab at Rhea's question about like the durability of the perceived radicality of open source, and maybe map that onto how, like, just really briefly, like about how also there's this perceived radicality of certain people or projects and movements? If you want to speak to why those types of that perception is so durable, just to close out, because you said you had nothing to add. So I'm like, well, I think you have something to add on that.
Sorry, my internet just dropped out. Could you pose the question one last time, please?
Yes, it's Rhea's question, and I'm just adding on to it. Like, why is the idea of radicality so attached to open source? Like, why is it so, despite the evidence that it's not that, why is it so hard for people to break that? And then also, like, you know, there are certain things in movement like that are seen as inherently radical that people do, and it's evidence that they're not radical, like the organization, the 501c3 organization, you know, and a bunch of people, there is an inherent radicality in people just coming together to say that they oppose prisons, right? So, but why does that durability in both the open source movement and broadly on the left exist? Why is it so hard for people to break the brand of radicality away from things that are clearly not radical? That's the question.
Yeah. I'm going to stand by saying that I don't think I have anything to offer that these wonderful people haven't already offered. But like, my instinct is just to say, and this isn't me giving a definition of radicality, but rather to speak on my experience of radicality. Radicality is like what we do. And often in spaces on the left and in spaces where we're talking about disruptive tech, that is like, those people are talking, that's a radicality of like talk. There's a lack of action, because once you get into the streets and you're testing new software and you're seeing the impacts of both software in the streets and digital software, the inherent lack or presence of radicality can't be ignored. So like, this doesn't feel like a very profound thing to say, but it's just like, we can't shake these things because there's so many people in these spaces who are blowing hot air. We're constantly like that's all. Sorry to bring this guy into this space, but as a person who wants to be known as a tech disruptor, that's all Elon Musk does is talk about the radicality and how disruptive he is. And then when you get to the actual do of his tech, it sucks. You don't have to have a degree in computer science and sourcing in GIS or whatever to like know that the tech itself sucks. And so it's very easy on the left, the same phenomenon shows up to talk about how radical you are and how pure your politics are. And then when it comes to the ground of building basic infrastructure for having a consistent Tuesday meeting, you can't. That basic mundane radicality is missing. And so, yeah, I would really ask that people really sit with the radicality of action and the impact of action over the radicality of words.
Period. I think that's a great place to end with only 1 minute at the hour, because y'all know I'm the late queen. But yeah, that's really great. Thank you everybody for coming. This recording will be available. I'm gonna stop it. Thank you to the DII participants who are in the house this afternoon.